Every Thursday morning just after sunrise, a flatbed truck rumbled down the gravel lane outside Bridger Hollow, Wisconsin. It backed onto a patch of open pasture, tipped its load, and pulled away, leaving behind a steaming, dark mound that drew flies before the dew had even burned off the grass. The truck belonged to Voss Dairy, the largest milking operation in the county. It had been making this same drop for 14 straight months. Most people in town assumed whoever agreed to take that manure was either desperate or out of his mind. They didn't expect that man to eventually need a locked gate to keep buyers off his property. Because the man waiting at the end of that gravel lane never complained about the smell. He never asked Voss Dairy for a dime to haul it away. He checked his watch, waved at the driver, and walked back toward a shed that, within a few years, would be doing something nobody in 3 counties could quite explain. He wasn't clearing away a problem. He was building something out of it, and not even his own wife understood why he kept smiling. If stories about ordinary people finding fortune in what everyone else throws away keep you watching until the end, take a second to subscribe. Like this video if you believe patience is still a competitive advantage, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing this community grow. Roy Talbot was 36 when Bridger Hollow welcomed him back, though nobody threw a parade. He arrived with a rented truck, 2 suitcases, and the exhaustion of a man who had spent 14 years scheduling freight routes for a regional shipping company in Madison, right up until the company consolidated its Midwest hub and let 200 people go in a single afternoon email. Roy wasn't wealthy, and he wasn't desperate. He had a small severance, an old truck, and 40 acres that had belonged to his grandfather, Otis Talbot, who'd passed away when Roy was 19 and still chasing a paycheck instead of a purpose. The land hadn't been farmed in years, the fences sagged, the barn roof had a hole the size of a dinner plate, but it was paid for, and that meant more than people expected. Neighbors remembered Roy as a quiet kid who used to trail behind his grandfather in the garden instead of playing ball with the other boys. Now he was a grown man standing in an overgrown field, wondering what to do with land that had given up trying to be useful. He didn't know it yet, but the answer was about to arrive in the back of a dump truck. 3/4 of a mile down the same gravel road sat Voss Dairy, a 4-generation operation milking close to 900 cows. Garrett Voss, the current owner, didn't dislike his herd. He disliked the sheer volume of what they produced. A single dairy cow generates roughly 80 pounds of manure a day. Multiply that by 900 animals, and Garrett wasn't just running a dairy. He was managing a relentless waste disposal operation that also produced milk. Wisconsin's environmental rules required dairies to store, treat, and apply manure carefully. Unmanaged runoff could overload nearby streams with nitrogen and phosphorus, triggering algae blooms and fines reaching 6 figures. Storage lagoons filled fast, and spreading manure directly on cropland had limits. Too much at once didn't feed a field, it burned it. That spring, Garrett had already paid contractors to haul away excess manure at a cost that made his accountant wince. So when Roy mentioned, almost as a joke at the feed store, that he had 40 idle acres and wouldn't mind taking some of the load, Garrett didn't hesitate. "Take as much as you want," Garrett told him. "Free, you're saving me money either way." Roy didn't have a business plan. He barely knew what compost was, beyond a vague memory of dark soil and eggshells from his grandfather's garden. He just had open land and a stubborn instinct that something this hard to get rid of couldn't stay worthless forever. That instinct had a source most of the town had forgotten about. When Roy was 8, his grandfather Otis kept a compost heap behind the tool shed that Roy's mother called "that disgusting pile" and refused to walk near. Otis called it something else entirely. "Treasure chest," he used to say, turning it with a pitchfork while Roy held his nose. Most folks throw away the very thing that would have made them rich, because rich doesn't always look rich on the first day. Roy remembered watching coffee grounds, eggshells, and dead leaves vanish into something dark and crumbly that made his grandfather's tomatoes grow taller than the fence. He never understood why Otis seemed prouder of that pile than of anything else on the property. "Why do you keep stirring garbage?" Roy had asked once. Otis had laughed, low and easy. "Because nobody else wants to. That's usually where the opportunity's hiding." Roy hadn't thought about that conversation in 20 years. Standing in his grandfather's overgrown field, staring at a free mountain of manure that Garrett Voss couldn't wait to unload, the memory surfaced as if it had been waiting the whole time. He didn't know the science yet, but he recognized the feeling. Roy's first compost pile was a disaster. He dumped raw manure into a heap, watered it occasionally, and waited. 3 weeks later, instead of rich soil, he had a soggy, foul-smelling mass that drew flies from across the county and a phone call from a neighbor threatening to report him. His second attempt overheated, climbing past 170 degrees and killing off the very microorganisms meant to break the material down. His third pile went the opposite direction, stalling out cold because he hadn't accounted for proper aeration. Roy began spending his evenings with agricultural extension publications instead of a television. He learned that healthy compost depended on a careful balance of carbon-rich brown material, like dried leaves and straw, and nitrogen-rich green material, like fresh manure. Too much nitrogen, and a pile turned anaerobic and rancid. Too much carbon, and it took forever to break down at all. He learned that moisture mattered just as much. A pile needed the dampness of a wrung-out sponge, never a swamp and never a desert. Turning the pile fed oxygen to the bacteria and fungi that converted raw waste into stable, usable humus. A compost thermometer showed him that an active pile needed to hold between 131 and 170 degrees Fahrenheit, long enough to kill weed seeds and pathogens, then cool gradually through curing. His fourth pile finally worked. Almost. It looked right. It smelled earthy instead of foul. But when he gave bags of it to 2 local gardeners as a test, one came back complaining that nothing she planted would grow. The compost hadn't finished curing. An immature compost can pull nitrogen out of surrounding soil instead of feeding it, stunting whatever it touches. Setbacks kept piling up. A second-hand tractor blew a hydraulic line the first time he tried turning a windrow mechanically. A spring storm flooded his curing area, washing away 2 months of work. Customers who'd shown polite interest stopped returning his calls. Roy didn't quit. He adjusted his ratios, rebuilt his drainage, and learned patience the same way his grandfather once had, one failed batch at a time. If you believe most failures are just lessons arriving early, give this video a like before we keep going. It helps stories like Roy's find their way to more people who need them. The first real success arrived through a single satisfied customer, a retired schoolteacher named Linda Ashworth, who used Roy's properly cured compost in her vegetable beds and came back 3 weeks later asking for more. "My tomatoes have never looked like this," she told him, holding up a fruit the size of a softball. Word moved slowly in a town like Bridger Hollow, but it moved. A local landscaper, Pete Anders, started buying compost by the truckload, struck by how dark and fine it was compared to the bagged blends at the hardware store. Then Hollow Creek Vineyard called, looking for an organic soil amendment that wouldn't interfere with their no synthetic input policy. Roy's compost, made entirely from dairy manure and shredded leaves, with no chemical additives, fit perfectly into the regenerative and organic farming practices that depended on rebuilding soil biology rather than feeding plants with synthetic fertilizer. Briar Patch Organics, a small certified organic farm 20 minutes away, became his next customer, ordering enough compost to amend 3 full acres ahead of planting season. Their farm manager explained something Roy hadn't fully grasped. Healthy soil wasn't just dirt holding a plant upright. It was an ecosystem of fungi and microorganisms cycling nutrients in ways synthetic fertilizer never could. By the following spring, Roy had outgrown his original setup. He wasn't just clearing manure off Garrett Voss's hands anymore. He was solving a waste problem the dairy industry had wrestled with for decades, and people were starting to notice. Then the Bridger Hollow Public Works Department called, asking whether Roy could process leaf and yard waste from the township's fall collection program. That single phone call changed everything. Roy hired his first 2 employees that year, a father and son team who didn't mind early mornings or the smell. He bought a used compost turner that processed windrows in a fraction of the time his old tractor attachment had managed, and poured concrete pads to keep runoff from reaching nearby waterways. He leased 60 more acres from a retiring farmer down the road and added a second-hand trommel screener, bought at an auction across the state line, which separated finished compost from larger debris for a finer, more consistent product. Within 2 years, Roy had moved past bulk truckload sales entirely. He launched a bagged line under a simple brand, Hollow Ground Organics, carried by 2 regional hardware chains and a growing list of independent garden centers across southern Wisconsin. Demand kept outpacing what one dairy's manure could supply, so Roy struck agreements with 2 more area farms desperate to offload their own surplus, turning what once cost those farms money in disposal fees into a small revenue stream for them as well. Municipal contracts followed in 2 neighboring townships. By his 4th year, Roy's operation was processing thousands of tons of organic material annually, turning what regulators once classified as agricultural waste into one of the most requested soil products in the region. None of it happened suddenly. Every expansion answered a problem the last stage of growth had created. That was the part most people never saw, how unglamorous and methodical real growth actually is. Frank Dunmore, a longtime landowner who farmed corn and soybeans 2 properties over, had laughed loudest when Roy first began accepting truckloads of manure onto his grandfather's old field. "Boys running a charity for cow manure," Frank used to joke at the feed store, loud enough for Roy to hear. 4 years later, Frank's truck idled in the same gravel driveway where Garrett Voss's trucks once dumped manure for free. Except now Frank was paying $80 a cubic yard for finished compost to revive soil that had grown thin after decades of conventional row cropping. Roy didn't bring up the old joke. He didn't need to. He helped Frank load the truck the way Garrett had once unloaded his. Frank glanced toward the converted tool shed that now served as Roy's office, then back at the bags loaded into his truck bed. He didn't say anything about being wrong. He didn't have to. Some realizations don't arrive with an apology. They arrive in a transaction, in the quiet exchange of money for something a person once mocked for free. Roy still kept his grandfather's old pitchfork hanging in the office that used to be a tool shed. Visitors sometimes asked about it, expecting a story about sentimental value. The real story was simpler. Otis Talbot never taught Roy anything about composting science or carbon-to-nitrogen ratios. He taught him to look at something everyone else dismissed and ask one different question. Not, "Why is this garbage?" but "What is this garbage waiting to become?" That shift in perspective ended up worth more than any business degree Roy never earned. It turned free manure nobody wanted into a compost operation now valued well past $1 million, supplying farms, vineyards, nurseries, and homeowners across half the state. The dairy down the road still sends its trucks every week. They still unload for free. But the operation receiving them now employs a dozen people and turns away more buyers than it can supply. Roy never set out to build an empire. He set out to solve one ordinary problem with patience instead of impatience, the same patience his grandfather modeled decades earlier over a pile most people refuse to touch. Maybe that's the lesson underneath every story like his. The things we walk past as worthless are often just waiting for someone willing to look twice. If this story reminded you that opportunity often looks like a mess before it looks like a miracle, subscribe for more stories like Roy's. Drop a comment with the most unexpected opportunity you've ever noticed, and share this with someone who needs the reminder that patience still pays.